So, could Moldova apply for NATO membership? Well, Moldova's president, Maya Sandu, said in an interview with Political that her country was weighing its next step and potentially applying, and whether it would require a constitutional change to do so. She said, quote, "Now there is a serious discussion about our capacity to defend ourselves, whether we can do it ourselves or whether we should be a part of a larger alliance. And if we come at some point to the conclusion that as a nation we need to change neutrality, this should happen through the democratic process." So obviously there's a lot of processes that need to take place for them to even apply for NATO. And then additionally, there's going to be a lot of processes to take place for them to join NATO. But let's say they do join NATO. What do they bring to the table? Well, currently in their country, they have about 700,000 military-aged males. Those are what you would consider the fighting force of a country if you had to have a national call up in times of a major war. They field a 6,500 person professional military. That's quite small, even by any country in NATO standards. Not even comparing them to the U.S., 6,500 person professional military is really small, and a lot of it is in just ground, and a small portion is in air forces. They're supported by about 2,000 conscripts and have 70,000 reservists. So again, very small military. They spend about $25 million on their military, which is 0.5% of their GDP. Now, to join NATO, that number would have to come up to $100 million to meet the 2% GDP requirement that NATO has of its countries. I got a big hair from my wife here. Anyways, whatever. I don't know. That might be a bridge too far because it is quite a poor nation. It is a poor nation because it is held back by its geography as well as its issues with Russia, which I'll talk about in a bit. Now, they are considered a NATO partner already and do train with NATO nations, and I have trained with them in Hohenfels and Grafenwehr, Germany. But the reality is they fly Soviet-era MiG-29s. And when I say Soviet era, these aren't like upgraded. These are Soviet era aircraft that they fly as if they are still the same from the 1970s and 80s. They don't have any tanks, and they use Soviet era armored personnel carriers. So very little is beneficial for them to NATO when it comes from the military force they would provide to NATO. But that's not to say that they aren't of value in any way, and I'll talk about that here in a sec. So here is Moldova, and from a strategic standpoint, they are sandwiched between Romania and Ukraine. They actually don't have access to the Black Sea other than via Ukraine in this region right here, mainly because Ukraine controls all of this territory here. So strategically, they're not super valuable to NATO. However, from a larger global standpoint, they are valuable to Russia, which is why they're getting nervous. And the reason for that is specifically, as I zoom out here, what's called the Bessarabian Gap. So that is actually right here. And granted, it is in Romanian territory for sure, but if Russia were to be able to take Ukraine and have Ukraine fall into Russian control, Moldova would naturally be their next potential target, because then it seals off the Bessarabian Gap pretty easily. Anyone through Romania would have to go up and attack through the mountains up here, as well as through this gap, which is a pinch point for Western nations. So that is why Moldova could be potentially valuable for Russia. Romania is still a formidable foe, and obviously we're seeing what Ukraine is doing, but this is what makes Moldova nervous, why they are looking to potentially apply for NATO membership. They do have one large problem, though, and I'll zoom in for this portion. So there is a portion of Moldova that sits like roughly through here that is called Transnistria. It is a breakaway nation that is under a separate control of a different government, and it is heavily supported by Russia, and Russia has troops in this region. So because of that, there is a problem. You can't be occupied by the Russians and join NATO, and Russians have occupied this area since the 1990s. So that is one major hurdle that Moldova would have to overcome, and it's unlikely that the United States or NATO itself would help Moldova eject Russia from this area. The best scenario is potentially Russia's collapse due to what has happened in Ukraine, and they give up supporting Transnistria, and Moldova is able to absorb it back into their control. So the reality of Moldova is they are probably looking at their own defense. They have found itself perilously close to the Ukraine war. I mean, just last week, they found missile debris that came from Russia as it was being intercepted by Ukrainians and flying into Moldovan territory because they border Ukraine. Because of that, any attacks on Ukraine's energy infrastructure actually knocks out power to Moldova as well. So when Ukraine loses power in certain areas, Moldova loses it too, and this poses problems as well. Problem is as I said, Russia occupies a small portion of Moldova, and they still maintain a fighting force there. Moldova must kind of balance how they approach this, trying to stay true to its pro-Western and EU trajectory, which it's on right now, but also not pissing off Russia to the point where Russia might try to bolster and use military force in Moldova. I don't think Russia's in the place to do that right now because of their weakness relative to Ukraine. And because of this severely weakened Russia, now might be the time for Moldova to actually take action on something bold like trying to join NATO.